Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association's Antitrust Law section. Today's topic is, what does a price fixer look like? Understanding the profile of criminal antitrust defendants. There has been a lot of experience over the years in prosecuting cartel cases, and just reading the news reports and looking at the pictures, it becomes very apparent that there are certain characteristics of defendants that are caught up in antitrust crimes that are common. Some of them may have to do with psychological issues, but one issue that we want to explore a little bit today is gender, because I think we find that many of the defendants that are brought into antitrust cases are male, and probably in proportions that greater than you would expect. So today we have two veteran prosecutors, now defense lawyers, that are going to talk a little bit about their experience and maybe try to understand how this trend is coming to be. My co-host today is Tammy Sue. Hi, Tammy.
Hi, John.
So, Tammy, what are we going to be talking about today?
Today we're talking about the psychology of price fixing.
And what do you mean about that, the psychology of price fixing?
So, John, I don't know about you, but it's never really occurred to me to get together with my competitors and say, hey, let's fix our prices together.
I just want to say, for the record, that has never occurred to me, and I've never done that. But go ahead.
That's a phenomenon and a crime known as price fixing. I've also never actually been in a situation where I have the authority to even fix prices or set prices for an organization. But every year, dozens of people, often but not always, company executives get prosecuted for price fixing. So who are these people? What do we know about them? And what drives them to fix prices?
Great. Well, who are our guests today?
Our guests we have two guests, Anna Pletcher and Heather Nyong'o. They have both spent a large portion of their careers prosecuting price fixers, and now they both actually defend people who are accused of price fixing and other antitrust and white collar violations.
What are we hoping to get out of today's conversation?
We're hoping to learn from their experiences.
Okay, well, let's bring in our guests. Anna, Heather, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Welcome. So Anna and Heather, please say a few words to introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and also how you got interested in this topic. Anna, do you want to go first?
Sure. I am a partner at O'Melveny & Myers. I spent a decade at the United States Department of Justice Antitrust Division, where I was assistant chief there, and spent my career focusing on price fixing, bid rigging, and collusion in the marketplace. And it was interesting that way I fell into this, because I was actually an investment banker before I became a lawyer. So it's been fascinating to be on the other side of that, actually prosecuting the folks who are now investment bankers. But it's been a great and very rewarding career.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Heather, how about you?
Sure. So I'm Heather Nyong'o. I started out my career in a boutique law firm in San Francisco called Farella, Braun & Martel, where I did antitrust and IP. And about 3.5 years into my career, I actually lateraled over into the antitrust division, where I had been a paralegal for 2 years before law school, and I was on the Microsoft trial. So it got me very interested in antitrust, and spent in total about a decade in the division as well. Almost 6 years ago, I lateraled out of the antitrust division over to WilmerHale, where I'm a partner in San Francisco.
Great. Thanks, Heather. So, Heather, how did you get interested in this topic, antitrust, price fixers and their profiles and any relationship to gender?
Well, I think, it was actually came to me recently as we were discussing this podcast. It's something that I know I've thought about for quite some time, and I think Anna has as well, based on just the kinds of cases that were coming to us when we were in the Antitrust division, and now being on the defense side for the past 6 years. Certainly, I'll tell you that all of the folks that I've defended have been men. All of the folks that I prosecuted were also men. However, I know Anna has a little bit of a different story to tell there. She prosecuted the only woman I know of who's actually gone to trial for engaging in bid rigging. So we can, I'm sure, talk a little bit about that. But I've been curious about it. I've drawn my own conclusions as to maybe some of the reasons why we don't see women involved generally in collusion and price fixing. I think obviously one of the main reasons is that women historically have not held positions of authority in organizations such that they would be able to be in even a position of price fixing. And then, of course, the next question is there also maybe more of a morality compass with women? And I think that maybe time will tell as women climb the ladder.
Yes.
Wow, Heather, thanks so much. I would love to hear more, Anna, from your experience of prosecuting the only woman who has been prosecuted for price fixing.
So thanks for bringing that up, Heather. Heather and I had offices very close to each other, so we have shared our experience at the Department of Justice prosecuting these cases. And the woman's name was Judy Green, and she was involved in a scheme where she was defrauding the government of money that was supposed to go to subsidize public schools. And I bring up these facts because I do think it might play into the gender angle here. She was the center of a hub and spoke conspiracy. So she would go to these schools and market herself as a consultant, and then she would rig the process for bidding on internet equipment. And she surrounded herself with other people who she would dole out these contracts to, and then they would give her a kickback. So she was operating in a sense pretty much by herself, and in the education sphere where she marketed herself as a specialist. So it's kind of interesting that that is an area, the education field, where women are more prominent, and that she was operating primarily alone as the organizer of this conspiracy makes her situation somewhat different than some of the price fixing cases where you might see a group of very high-level officers in corporations who are working together with other high-level officers in a collusive manner. So I do wonder if the facts had any impact on the gender angle.
And Anna, let me come back to you and ask you this question. You've obviously gotten to know a lot of defendants from both sides of the bench. Are there any personality attributes that you think are more or less common among folks? Are they more reckless? Are they more gregarious? What is somebody who gets themselves into this pickle? What do they look like?
It's an interesting question. There's certainly a profile, I think, to the leaders of some of these organizations. Judy Green, for example, who I mentioned, and there are others who come to mind who have been the ringleaders, who do tend to be risk takers, who are very people, right? They're very personable and gregarious, as you say, and they're able to persuade people to join them. And that leads to this kind of interesting question, too, about whether there's a cultural aspect to it, that when people kind of cross the line into this type of criminal behavior, you're doing it with other people. It's a conspiracy by nature. So you have to be able to persuade others, to get them to trust you, to bring them along into this activity. And there is a personality component to that.
Heather, I was going to ask you the same question. What do you think? Do you see any common personality threads?
I think there's actually more of a passive or a tacit sort of cultural implication here that I've seen in a lot of the cartels that I prosecuted and even those where I have been on the defense side. And that is that things like in any organization, there's a tone from the top sort of process that happens. And for those organizations that are compliance-minded, the tone from the top obviously helps to set the culture and ethos for a company, and that they shouldn't engage in this. And those are the folks who we're not out there prosecuting. But there is, for for the companies that engage in price fixing, typically there are long-standing conspiracies lasting sometimes over decades, where they started out, very, very early in some of the folks' careers, set by even the presidents of organizations, and they're the junior people who are just there kind of following along. And you'll find that for these conspiracies to actually work, oftentimes it's just the yes men who are trotting along day to day, doing their job and being directed by their superiors to do it, or being handed down to them a job that they're told that this is just the expectation of the job. And I've seen that in one particular cartel that I helped to prosecute in Puerto Rico, was the cargo shipping cases. And there, a person, he was elevated into a position of more of a sales authority, and he was just simply told, now you need to engage in price fixing with our competitors, the other shippers, and that's part of your job. And he thought long and hard about whether or not he should go forward with it, and he did go forward with it, and then eventually he was sitting there testifying in the trial against his superior, having pled guilty. So I think a lot of it is not necessarily like there's this Machiavellian or really nefarious thing emanating from people who engage in this behavior. I think it comes from sometimes the organizations within which they work.
Heather, that's fascinating. So I found it really interesting the types of industries that we hear about in the news who are engaged in price fixing. You mentioned cargo shipping. We've heard tubes that are involved in TVs, optical disc drives, now recently the tuna industry, the salmon industry. Have you thought about if there are certain industries that are especially susceptible, or certain, I guess, organizational structures in certain industries that make them more prone to price fixing?
Absolutely. There is definitely trajectory for when industries get to the brink of making the decision about whether or not to go the price fixing route or not. And it's usually one of the industries that I think really is important to mention is just the technology industry. We have our old office, and my old office, the San Francisco section of the criminal program of the Antitrust Division, prosecuted the DRAM cases. I was one of the lead lawyers on the LCD cases. There's also, you mentioned CRT tubes. So those are the TV tubes. These are all electronic component cases. And as you can imagine, when you first have a technology like, for example, the LCD panel, it was very, very expensive, very high barriers to entry. Only a few companies were making these very highly technical products, like the Japanese, and then the Koreans started to make it, and then the Taiwanese started to make these products, and so there was more competition, and then prices were getting depressed and lowering, and then eventually it got so bad that very sophisticated, customers like the Dells of the world, and computer OEMs, that were putting pressure on these companies to lower prices so they could offer better prices to their end consumers like you and I. And then what happens is, with all of that depression on the pricing, sometimes companies get together and commodity products, because once those products become commoditized where there's nothing to compete on except for price, then you see companies getting together because they're at the brink in their industry where about everything is about to fall apart, and some of them are going to have to go out of business because they can no longer compete, that they all say, let's get together and fight against this horrible thing that's happening to our industry.
I'm curious about, out of the cases that you guys have prosecuted in particular, have you met the defendants that you prosecuted, and what was that like? Anna, do you want to go first?
You mean met them outside of the context of the prosecution?
Within the context, as part of the prosecution, like had a conversation with them?
During the context of a prosecution, there usually isn't much opportunity to do that, certainly not without lawyers. And it's a very orchestrated situation. So I would have to say, no, I haven't been able to do that. But on the other side, in representing defendants, yes, and it is, it's definitely a different perspective to be on that side where you have an opportunity to really hear what was motivating get somebody to engage in this behavior and what they're thinking. And, it's never as simple or as easy as it might seem from the outside. And when a government, as the government puts their case together, it has to be kind of boiled down and simplified. And often the motivations are boiled down to just greed or something that you can help a jury understand. But in real life, it's more complicated than that. There are, as Heather mentioned, cultural aspects. There's certain culture within the firm. There are pressures coming from the outside. There are personal pressures. There are a lot of different issues that combine into these decisions that people make when they cross the line into this sort of criminal behavior.
Great, thanks. Heather, anything to add?
No, I think Anna summed it up really, really well. I mean, the only thing I would say on a personal level, even as a prosecutor, I had a lot of trials, particularly surrounding the LCD case, and so spent a lot of time with the individuals who I was the one who, entered in their plea agreement and negotiated the sentence, and they did go to jail, and then they came back to testify, and so I had a lot of time with several of the individuals, and I completely agree with Anna, and I think it wasn't hard for me to go to the defense side because I really believe this is a gray area. I generally, and even as a prosecutor, did not believe that the people that even I prosecuted and even put in jail were bad people. I think they made mistakes. Oftentimes they were contrite. They accepted responsibility, and they severely and dearly paid for it. And then they would help the prosecution in doing what's right and prosecuting those who were not accepting responsibility. And so I found them to be many times very honorable men. And that's certainly the case on the defense side, even more so. And in fact, I've had the benefit, I guess, of actually defending several folks, all men, who actually did not engage in the conduct that the government had accused them of. And in fact, very recently, and luckily got the acquittal for my client who was accused of the biggest price-fixing conspiracy that this country has ever encountered or the world has ever encountered, and that was in the foreign exchange case. And I can't tell you that there's anyone in the world I think is more honorable than my client, Rohan, who luckily was not found guilty and did not go to jail. But again, people can be falsely accused here. There are also people who are following direction of their superiors. There are people who are not really clear on the conduct, but they engage in it only to learn later on that it was wrong. And there are people who brazenly go into it and price fix. So it's not to say that they're all innocent folks, but I do think it's a very complicated psychology when it comes to price fixing.
Heather, what do you think about punishment in price fixing? The jail sentences and the criminal fines and the trajectory, where you see it going and where you think it should be?
Yeah, so many years ago, I think, 2004, they changed the statutory max for jail terms from 3 years to 10 years. And I think that was a really important thing for Congress to do, because when the max was 3 years, what you were seeing was either non-custodial sentences or folks going to jail for between 3 to 6 months. And that wasn't enough of a deterrent. So I do think that the 10-year factor is the statutory max. I think it will be at that for a very long time. I do not see it changing to anything above that, especially given the fact that, if I'm right, that it was 2004 and we're now in 2019, so 15 years later, and the longest sentence you've ever seen for a Sherman Act violation is against Frank Peake, who was involved in this shipping case I mentioned in Puerto Rico, and he received 5 years. But for the most part, before him, the highest sentence was 36 months or 3 years. And the average sentence, I would say, right, these days is about a year and a day, which really means about 10 months of service.
So Heather and maybe Anna, I'll come back to you this time. I want to go back to the question about, we talked a little bit about psychology of the defendants. Let's talk about kind of the socioeconomic or the status of the defendants. I have seen studies that have suggested that over 90% or maybe even over 95% of the defendants are male. Part of that may have to do with just whether men are filling certain types of jobs, whether through sexism or choice or something. How much of that do you think plays into this?
Well, it is certainly a significant factor. Having the opportunity to lead a corporation and to engage in collusion is a prerequisite to actually becoming a price fixer. And I just pulled some numbers recently and to look at the number of women CEOs in the Fortune 500. So 10 years ago, 2009, there were 15. That's only 3%. Today, they're 33, so 6.7%. And that's a minuscule number. And that's just the Fortune 500. But if we consider that as representative, we're going to see a very, very small number of women who even have the opportunity to engage in price fixing at that level. And I think that's reflected in Heather's experience and my experience in terms of the people who we actually see coming across our radar screen as prosecutors. So that's a significant component for sure.
Heather, and maybe to you this question: many of the cartels that the Department of Justice has prosecuted have emanated outside of the United States, sometimes in countries where there is a clear gender demarcation about what employment women take and what employment men take. Do you think that's a factor at all in sort of how these statistics seem to be getting skewed?
Yeah, I do. I definitely think it is. I mean, I think if you look at the very few instances where we do see women involved in price fixing or bid rigging, you're going to see that those women are resident in the United States. So I do think that I guess the opportunities, like as Anna described it, are greater for women to contribute to collusion in the U.S. than when we have seen in cartels, abroad. And as you mentioned, a number of the cartels, at least the cartels that in the technology industry that we prosecuted out of San Francisco, were typically Asian cartels. And I will say that it was all men who were involved, but the LCD conspiracy had a very unique, interesting fact that we made sure the jury heard about there, which was that the price, obviously anybody who had pricing authority were the men, but eventually the cartel began to dissolve a little bit, and people started getting worried. It's after the DRAM cases started happening, and there began to be more awareness in Asia about potential for concern of criminal exposure, even in the U.S., even if you're never set foot in the United States. And so the LCD conspiracy, what they did was they actually moved the conspiracy down to what they called the female employees, who they had the female employees of the various organizations meet in karaoke bars to exchange the pricing and supply information with each other and then bring them back to their bosses. So in a way, there were definitely women in the LCD cartel, but they were absolutely pawns in the greater overarching conspiracy.
Just goes to show you that nothing good happens in karaoke bars.
Exactly.
So maybe Anna, going back to you, we're running a little bit short of time, but I just had a couple of maybe quick follow-up questions. Anna, going back to you, is there anything to be learned by companies about the fact that about the profile of folks who get in trouble? How should they incorporate any learning into compliance policies or prevention efforts?
I'm going to interject. Do not hire people who love karaoke bars. Just kidding.
Well, one important point to think about is the diversity of the corporate board and the diversity of the management team. Because I do think that to engage in a conspiracy, to do criminal activity, it helps to have people around you who look like you, who think like you, who you trust, and you can kind of band together to break the law. But if you have a diverse viewpoint, you have different people around you in those decision-making positions, they may be more willing to ask, what are we doing here? Or there may be more of a reluctance to engage in that type of behavior when you know the person sitting across from you might not be thinking the same as you. So thinking about increasing that diversity, I think, is an important takeaway.
So groupthink basically is a risk for corporations and could lead to non-compliant groupthink, obviously then cascades the problem. Heather, any thoughts on that point? Anything that your clients that you are helping to prevent these types of problems? Anything that you can tell them to help them do that?
Yeah, I think it goes to kind of one of the original points that we were discussing is again, a compliance culture and tone from the top, making sure that the highest level executives are not only endorsing being compliant with the antitrust laws, but talking about how it's just unacceptable to do anything but compete on the up and up. And I've heard of organizations where even the highest level executives are required and expected to do a rotation through the compliance department in order to really solidify that culture. So I think that's definitely a movement I'm seeing all across the world where compliance programs, which never were a thing, are now very much the part of a company's culture and overall organization.
Well, thank you both. This was really fun. We'd like to ask you a few questions that I think our listeners may be interested in learning a little bit more about you and sort of how you came to be where you were. Anna, maybe starting with you. You obviously enjoy prosecuting and defending antitrust cases. What's fun about that? What is it that makes you excited about your job today, as well as your job that you did for many years as a prosecutor?
It's an area of the law that affects people's everyday lives. As a prosecutor, I got a lot of satisfaction in knowing that helping to kind of keep our economy going, make sure that consumers have a fair shake. And there was a real feeling of satisfaction in doing that job. And now on the other side, it's helping people solve their problems. It's helping corporations do things the right way and stay out of trouble, and helping them compete in a fair way on that side. So from both sides of this, there is this kind of drive to keep our economy free and fair, and that feels very satisfying, very good.
Heather, go ahead, Tammy.
Heather, I want to ask you the same question, but with a little spin to it. If I'm a young lawyer and I'm interested in criminal antitrust, and I'm trying to decide if I should go in earlier on in my career, like you and Anna had, into prosecuting, or rather go to a law firm and defend people who are accused of criminal antitrust crimes, what would you say to people who are trying to decide?
Well, I absolutely loved being a prosecutor. I thought it was the best job in the world. But I will tell you that being on the defense side, having had the perspective of being a prosecutor, I love it all the more. And I think it's because not only is it all the things that Anna talked about, but it's also just so interesting. And on the defense side, you get to do a lot more stuff. And when you're in the government, you're kind of more one-track mind focused on each individual investigation. Whereas on the defense side, you have so many different clients with so many different interesting problems, and you learn so much about their business, but really just the people. You get to have a connection with people in a different way than when you're a prosecutor, because it's much more of an arm's length, obviously, relationship. And so on the defense side in particular, I also get to experience when I feel like there's injustice, and I get to be there to stand by someone's side and actually pushing back against the government when it's being overzealous, and that does happen. And the government has a ton of power. And that gets to my advice to young people. I think it's really, really important, if you can do this, to actually spend some time in private practice before you go into the government. Because as a prosecutor, you wield so much power, so much leverage. I mean, really, companies and individuals they're kind of completely under your thumb. And if they work with you and they're cooperative and they're helpful, obviously prosecutors, will work with that, and hopefully there's a good accommodation between both sides. But ultimately, the prosecution does have all of the power, and they of course have the power of whether or not to indict someone, no matter how much you argue against it or how much you demonstrate that it's not, that the indictment is just really incorrect. So it's good to have a little bit of defense side experience before you become a prosecutor, so that you understand the other side a little bit better, as opposed to just kind of barreling ahead and with your ideals. Instead, you have some more pragmatism to you, and it actually really helps you to be very effective in negotiation when you have that. But I definitely don't think, I think that a career in this field in particular, where you have the opportunity to go into the government, I 100% would say always take that opportunity if you have it. I think that it's critical to be able to know how the government thinks, to be able to defend your clients in the best way when you do go back out into the defense side.
Okay, so Anna, back to you. Tell us something surprising or unusual about yourself that we wouldn't know if we only knew you professionally.
Okay. So how about this one? My husband and I ride a tandem bike, and we were the very first tandem bike riders to complete this ride around Puerto Rico called La Vuelta, so a circle around the island, 375 miles in 3 days.
Wow.
And we're still married, 21 years. Are you speechless, John?
I'm trying to think about how to respond to that. I mean, my wife and I don't drive a tandem bike. We've talked about getting a motorcycle with a sidecar, but she seems to have rejected that idea. Heather, how about you? Tell us something surprising or unusual about yourself.
I guess what's kind of surprising or unusual is that just almost exactly 1 year ago, I became married to a man whose last name is Nyong'o, and married into an entirely exciting and very interesting culture, the Kenyan people. And his cousin is Lupita Nyong'o. And so I've kind of been catapulted not only into an entirely different, new, exciting world, but I find myself at movie premieres and things like that, which I never, ever expected in a million years I would be at. So it's kind of a different life, but an exciting one.
Any tips that you can give us at the Antitrust Law section about how we can make some of our events more like movie premieres?
This is actually very close to one, John. I was going to say, with the music coming into it, and you have a very good radio voice, I feel like I'm right now in a mass, wonderful production. Well, about to be at a movie premiere with you.
I've been told I have a face for radio and a voice for transcription. But with that, let's go to our final section, which is called The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for The Curious Hat!
So this is the final segment of the show. Here's what we do. I have an actual hat, which has actual questions in it. Because our two guests are remote today, I'm going to ask them to choose a number between 1 and 25, and then I will ask them the question that corresponds with that number, and we will learn something more about our guests. So, Anna, why don't you go first? Pick a number between 1 and 25.
15.
15. Okay. Anna, this is a good question. Number 15. What do you wish you knew when you started your career?
Oh, I wish I knew that careers change and that it's okay not to know what you're going to be doing 10 years from now or 15 years from now, but that you're happy doing what you're doing now. And wherever life takes you, it's okay. You don't have to have, it's tough for us type A lawyers, right, to accept that. So that is what I wish I would have done.
And how would you have told your 21 or 22-year-old self that everything is going to be okay? Would your 21-year-old self have accepted that?
Well, I like to think I would. I like to think I would listen to some good advice, but it's the kind of thing that you probably have to live a little bit in order to actually come to accept.
I just think I never would listen to me. But Heather, how about why don't you pick a number between 1 and 25, and we'll see if we can come up with a question.
8.
Number 8. Heather, what is your perfect weekend?
Oh, gosh. My perfect weekend is actually spending time up in Mount Shasta, where we have a little house with my husband, my dog Coconut, and my 2 kids, Graham and Emma.
And what do you do up in Mount Shasta?
Literally sit there and stare at the mountain, which is awesome.
And I don't know how to respond to that. So with that, we come to the end of our episode. Thank you, everybody, and we will join you next time on Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.